Good evening. Glad you guys to be out here tonight to worship. Full disclaimer, I haven't preached in a long time, so bear with me and we'll see how this goes. So, also, next lesson will be on preparedness. I forgot to ask about this, so looks like I figured it out. So tonight, if you couldn't figure out, we're going to talk about creation. And this came up recently because I was asked the question about, is creation literal? Are the days of creation actual literal, or were they figurative? And this has come up several times, throughout the years, and it's always good to revisit these type of things. And for me personally, when you get asked this, you just kind of like have that ingrained in your head. You're like, oh yeah, it's literal, and that's the end of it. But really, it's good for us to know why and to really analyze so that we have a ready answer with these type of things and are able to thoroughly prove these things. So when talking about creation, there are typically, I'm going to overgeneralize and say there's roughly 3 buckets of people. So there's the people like me who believe that creation is real and believe that it was a literal 7 days, as the Bible says. There's also the bucket of people who may believe in God and creation, but they might not necessarily believe it was literal. They might believe it's figurative because maybe the way they read Genesis, or they might be discouraged by things like science and saying they see what they see in science and they think that possibly that the explanation is that this is figurative to match with what science has to say. And then lastly, the obvious one is those who just don't believe in creation, that they don't believe that God exists. And once again, that goes back to the whole science thing. They might believe that, well, science says that the earth is millions of years old and the universe is even older, so it doesn't make sense that God created this earth. So we want to address points that kind of hit all those groups of people. And so tonight, we want to look at a few things. We want to see that the Bible says that creation is real and that it's literal. That God literally created the world in 7 days. And really 6 days. I say 7, and when I say 7 or 6, I mean that he literally created in 6 days and then had the 7th day of rest. And then we also want to look at, well, what about science? How do we address that? And hopefully through this we'll start to see some of the power of God. And finally we want to look at some examples of God and the power of God and see that if he has all this power, that he can create the world in 7 days. So our proof text is obviously Genesis chapter 1. And we're going to read in another disclaimer. I don't actually have any of the verses up written for you, so you're going to have to do some work and actually go through the Bible and flip through with me. So hopefully that'll keep you awake through my monologue tonight. So Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1, we'll just read a few verses. In verse 1 it says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Then God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. And God saw the light, and that was good, and God divided the light from darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So the evening and the morning were the first day." So here we see the first example of this day in verse 5, and he uses this verbiage is used 6 times in Genesis chapter 1. And I can see for some people how this might be jarring. You read verses 1 through 5, and this is kind of abstract to us to imagine what God is doing and creating this light and dark, and then saying, well, he did all this in 1 day, and then it later goes on throughout the rest of Genesis chapter 1 and seeing that. For those of you who might be Tolkien fans, this kind of reminds me of the Silmarillion and how they describe that being created in that realm and how very abstract it was. And so maybe I see that people maybe look at this and think it's kind of abstract. So we want to get into that. We want to prove, well, is it abstract or is it actual literal? So there's a Hebrew word that's pronounced yom. And yom, according to Strong's and New American Standard Concordance, it's Hebrew for day, or a 24-hour period, or this morning, this period of time consisting of the evening and morning. And so we want to look at this word yom and how it's used in the Old Testament, and to get a feel for it, right? Get a literal feel for how this word is used. And so I just picked out 2 examples of how this is used. It's used over 2,000 times in the Old Testament. But I tried to pick out some interesting examples. The first one gets bonus points because it's in Daniel. So in Daniel chapter 1, we see that Daniel is a captive of Babylon. So here he has this chief eunuch that is in charge of him, and he's instructed to give Daniel of the food of kind of like the best food from the king's stores, and Daniel essentially rejects this. And so finally, the eunuch's kind of upset about this because if something happens to Daniel, his head's on the line. So he brings this up to Daniel, and eventually Daniel responds in verse 12 of Daniel chapter 1. And it says there, Daniel's saying, "Please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies as you see fit, so deal with your servants." Then he consented with them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in the flesh than all of the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. So the point here is that Daniel is talking to someone else. The Bible is using the Hebrew word yom in this case. And when Daniel makes this deal with this eunuch, he says 10 days. And the interesting thing about this is there was no room for interpretation. It was simply 10 days. And the eunuch understood it as 10 days. And after these 10 days had passed, they simply did their test and saw the differences. You didn't see at the end the eunuch go like, "Well, I didn't know that you meant a literal 10 days." He didn't try to then haggle with them and say, "Well, you meant that figuratively and you meant years or aeons or something." They meant 10 days. Another example of, I have to click forward. Another example of this being used is in Genesis chapter 40. So in Genesis chapter 40, we see Joseph, who is in Egypt, and God gives him the power to interpret dreams. And so he's here, and he has this butler and this baker who have these dreams, and essentially Joseph interprets them for them. And so we see in verse 12 of Genesis chapter 40, where Joseph starts to interpret the butler's dream. And it says in verse 12, Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days, and within 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler." So Joseph is taking this kind of figurative or this abstract dream that this butler had, and he is interpreting this. He's essentially prophesying that in 3 days things are going to happen to him, and he's using this word this word yom is being used in the Bible to describe this. And at this point in time, however, we don't know that these 3 days are literal yet because it was a prophecy. We don't know that it's come to pass. But spoiler alert, we'll see here in a few verses what actually happens, that this will come true. So then the baker sees this and he gets all excited. So he asks Joseph to also interpret his dream, which was probably not a good idea on his part. And we see in verse 18 where Joseph answers the baker and says, "This is an interpretation of your dream. The 3 baskets are 3 days, and within 3 days Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you." So not near as good news as the butler got, but the same sort of thing happened here. He interpreted this figurative dream as 3 days, these 3 baskets in this, and he's saying that in 3 days something's going to happen. And then fortunately for us, and right the next verse, in verse 20, it says, "Now it came to pass on the 3rd day." So Joseph prophesied that in 3 days these things would happen, and they did. And in all 3 of these cases, all 3 terms, all 3 uses of this word yom, we find that it was literal, and that this was a literal day. So just as literal as the word yom is being used here, it's also used in Genesis chapter 1, if you didn't figure that out already. That's where we're going with this. So in Genesis chapter 1, it uses the same exact word to describe these days of creation. So the point here is the Bible uses the literal word for day to describe what God did in creation. And thus, since the Bible said that God created the world in 7 days, it simply did. But we don't want to leave it at that. I mean, for those of us who obviously believe in the Bible, we believe that it happened in 7 days because that's what it says. But there are still some people who may doubt. They may doubt because of science, or who simply just don't believe because of something like science or any other reason. So we do want to talk briefly about science. And I say briefly, but sometimes this might get convoluted, so we'll see how this goes. The first thing we want to point out, though, about science before we go anywhere else with this is God's wisdom is always greater than man's. So we can see this in kind of a contrast of this in Proverbs chapter 2 and verse 6, where it describes the Lord and said, "The Lord gives wisdom, and from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding." So this picture that all wisdom and knowledge comes from God. And then we see a stark contrast from something like in 1 Timothy 6 and 20, where it says, "O Timothy, guard what was committed to your trust, avoiding these profane and idle babblings and contradictions, what is falsely called knowledge." So this worldly knowledge that is coming at him. So there's that big contrast between those two things. So we want to keep that in mind when we talk about science, first and foremost. Next, we have these things that come up with science, these tools or these theories that science has to say, well, we think the Earth is millions of years old and that the universe is much, much older than that. Or through like carbon dating, or we have these theories because we see the way the universe is moving and that we think it all came from this explosion at the beginning of time and has been slowly expanding since. Or they might say that well, we pieced together these different bones and we see these different animals and we think that maybe man came from apes or something like that, right? So they have all these ideas. And so how do we address that? Well, one way of addressing it is, well, people will just say, well, God's wisdom is greater than man's. And that's good, but that's not going to convince anyone who doesn't believe in God, right? They're just going to say, well, I don't believe in God, and that's not going to get anywhere. The second way of dealing with that is often that you see in the Christian realm is that you would try to disprove or discredit these theories, right? And that's also good in a way, because a lot of these things do have big flaws with them. But the problem with that is when you get into some sort of debate with someone where you want to try to convert them to God in the scientific world, it almost turns into some sort of political debate where you're essentially trying to discredit them and what they say, and they're doing the same to you. And then basically what it devolves into is you saying, no, you're wrong, and they say, no, you're wrong, and then no one gets anywhere. No one's saved, no one's converted, and most likely you two are both frustrated about what's going on. So I propose this is a third option, or a third way to look at this, and that is we can prove that it's plausible that from a scientific point of view that God can exist. And if we can prove one simple truth about God, it can actually fit in with these things and show that God can actually cheat these systems, so to speak. And so you're kind of confused right now of where I'm going with this. So I'm going to propose to you, you have to bear with me for a second, the question of the chicken or the egg. So you might have heard this before, which came first, the chicken or the egg? And maybe you guys have thought about this before, or maybe you haven't, but a lot of times it's just thrown out there to confuse people. But I submit to you that the chicken probably came first. And if not, it was probably the chicken and the egg. And why do I say this? Well, we see in Genesis chapter 1 that God created everything in a functioning state. So when God created everything, at the end of each day, for example, the third day when he creates plants and trees and everything, at the very end of that he says in verse 12, he says, at the very end of verse 12, he says, and God saw that it was good. So he created all of these things, and he instructs all these things to exist, supposedly. Or not supposedly, but that's how he says it. Like, we don't understand how he exactly does it, but he just says, these things are to exist, and they do. God didn't literally go through and plant, right, each tree, and they exist, or they start to grow over weeks and months like we would do it. He just made them exist. So we see in Genesis chapter 1 that he created everything in a functioning order. And just like that with the chicken, he created a chicken and the chicken went about doing its business, right? So where am I going with this with science? Well, if you were to go back to the third day, if you were somehow be able to plant a scientist back into the third day of creation but not tell him anything about what's going on, and you show him a tree that God just created, he would see this tree and this big tree and you say, oh, that's cool, that's a big tree, right? And you ask him, well, how old is that tree? And he's like, well, I know trees take years to get old or to get this big, and he would suggest that maybe this tree is 20 years old. And you would say, well, how else could you tell? And he might chop down that tree, and he might observe that the rings in this tree say it's 20 years old. And he might carbon date that tree and says that the tree is 20 years old plus or minus 5 years because of what carbon dating does. But the point is, God literally just created that tree. And God has the power to create anything in any given state. So what I propose is that God, in his infinite power, can create the world or anything in any given state for us to exist in that prime time in the universe, right? So that we can exist and do his will. So what we need to try to pose to and prove to other people is that he can do this. And the problem with looking at just Genesis is you can't prove its own text within itself. So that would be like me saying something and then me not backing up or not someone else being able to back me up if I'm not trustworthy or something. You have to have multiple sources saying the same thing to confirm what I said. So you think, well, that's kind of hard, right, to prove Genesis. I see what you're saying. I see that God, from Genesis, I can assume we're kind of making a leap here that God can create anything, but it's not explicitly saying that. So are there any other examples of that in the Bible that we can prove that God can do that? Well, yeah, there are. Another example is God creates manna from nothing in that given state. In Exodus 16 and 14, we see where God does this. In verse 14, it said, this layer of dew lifted there in the surface of the wilderness, and there was a small round substance as fine as frost on the ground. And we see in 16, Israel was kind of confused, didn't know what it was, and then eventually Moses says at the end of 16, this is the bread which the Lord given to you to eat. And so this manna got here, was put here by God, and God created it. And if you were to somehow be able to transport back that time, get a piece of that manna, this weird thin bread that God was able to make, and give it to a scientist and tell them to analyze it, right? They would analyze it and they would say, well, this thing was probably baked and it probably came from flour before that or dough before that, right? And then it came from some sort of wheat, right? And they would be right in a way, right? That's the only way they can have to analyze it, but they don't have the whole picture. God has the power to create that manna and skip that natural process, just like he could skip that natural process with earth. Another example of this is in the New Testament. Jesus was able to create water from wine. And it's interesting that Jesus did this as first recorded miracle because this kind of helps go back to prove the first kind of supernatural thing in the Bible, right? Jesus creating this water from not wine proves that God can create anything from any given state and any sort of age or anything. And this goes back to prove the whole existence of God in creation and that he can do that in creation as well. We see this in John chapter 2 and verse 7 when Jesus said to these people at this party to fill these water pots with water. And when they filled them up to the brim, he said to them, draw some out now and take them to the master of the feast. And they took it. When the master of the feast had tasted this water that was made wine and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom, and he said to them, every man at the beginning sets out good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. You have kept the good wine until now. So if you were to go and ask this master of the feast, where did this wine come from? Well, he assumed this was the good wine, right? And so he obviously thought this wine was pretty good, and that if you were to ask him how it was made, he would probably analyze this and say, well, I mean, I know how wine's made, so it was probably fermented for a good amount of time because this is the good wine. And it was probably made from certain types of grapes that came maybe he'd assume where they came from because it was so good. And you go on and on about that and talk about the natural process of that. And that would be a logical conclusion to come to. However, we know what happened through what we see in the Bible, that Jesus actually created it, and he had the power to create it in that state. So we see from these two examples that God can create anything in any given state. And that goes back to prove that since he can make manna and he can make wine, he can do that with bigger things. He can do that with the earth. He doesn't need to make the earth from space dust and cosmic interactions over time. He can skip forward to the point in time where the earth is needed for us to exist. He just created it instantly in 7 days. So hopefully we see from here, we can go way more in depth and talk about way more, come up with way more logical arguments from here, but hopefully we've been able to prove the plausibility that to scientific community, that if we can prove that God can create anything in any state, that's why they see things the way they see it. They see the earth being super old is simply at an oversimplification of things, is because God made it that way. Also, the other thing hopefully we see from this is we begin to see the power of God. We see that God has this power that whatever he sets out to do, he can do it. He can create something simple like manna to supply his nation. He can supply water into wine just to show his power, or he can create the earth for us and to show his glory. Lastly, we would like to talk about the power of God in general. So we have this God who can create the earth, but we want to see more about that. And we see that he shows this all throughout the Old and the New Testament. For some reason, my animations must have not worked, so you get all of it at once kind of thrown at you. So bear with the information overload. So we see in the beginning in the Old Testament that God shows over and over and over his power. A really good example of this is in Exodus chapter 7, or in the whole events that take place with Egypt. In 7, we see the beginning of the 10 plagues, right? And God is able to go through and attack Egypt on the level of each one of their gods. And eventually, Pharaoh is able to see that power of God, right? And he lets the Israelite people go, at least for a time. And then God continues to show his power in this pillar of cloud and fire that is used to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. And then finally, he shows that power even further through Moses, by parting the Red Sea and allowing the Israelite nation to escape, and eventually crushing the Egyptians. And so we see in the Old Testament where God proves his power over and over the physical realm. And a God who can do all these things, and we believe all these things that he did and all these signs that he showed, why couldn't he create the earth in 7 days, right? We see all these things that he did. Is it so far of a stretch to then say that he could create the earth in 7 days? Furthermore, when Jesus comes to this earth, God made flesh. He's able to, we already showed that in John chapter 2 that he was able to make water into wine, and we see several more instances of him showing his power over the physical realm by healing the sick. But then he even goes a step further. And we talked about this last week in class, but he actually rose someone from the dead in John chapter 11. And what's interesting about this is that Lazarus had been dead for days. And so death is literally the separation of our bodies from our spirit. And so they had somehow been separated for 4 days. And Jesus had so much power, and that complete power of the spiritual realm, that he can essentially reunite Lazarus' spiritual and physical body. And we don't know how that works, right? But we know through this miracle that he has that complete dominance over the spiritual realm, that complete power. And he also did this through, also we've seen those examples of him casting out demons and other things like that. But the point is, a God who shows his complete power, not only over the physical realm, but the spiritual realm as well. I mean, why couldn't he create the world in 7 days? Lastly, we see God showing his complete power over sin. Jesus is recorded in all four epistles that his whole life he was sinless, and he was eventually put on the cross. and put to death, and he was able to be resurrected and show that complete dominance over sin. So we see here that God has all power. He has power over the physical realm, he has power over the spiritual realm, and he has ultimately power over sin. And this God, who's able to do these things, he's able to create this earth. So hopefully we've seen tonight from these things that, first of all, God created the world. God created the world, and he did that in 7 days. And no matter what science says, there are plausible explanations for why they see what they see. God has that power to create anything in any given state, that ultimate power to do those things. We see God's power on display constantly throughout the Old and New Testament, his complete power over the physical realm, over the spiritual realm, and finally over sin. And hopefully we've been able to see from this lesson that he puts that in display, and hopefully we can fully appreciate our God and this type of power that he has. So that's the lesson for tonight. If you haven't submitted to this power of God, if you haven't submitted to this God who is almighty, who had created this earth, and you realize that that is someone that you want to serve, you want to submit to this, and you want to be a part of this. We see in the 4 epistles that Jesus showed his complete power over sin so that we can be reconciled with him. If anyone has any sort of spiritual need, if you decide you want to be subject to God and you want to be reconciled with him, we can help you with baptism tonight. If you have already submitted to God, but maybe you're just struggling, maybe you have doubts, maybe doubts about science, doubts about anything, you need prayers, anything like that, we can help you with that. If you have any sort of spiritual need at this time, please come forward as we stand and sing.